The fight had become something primal and raw and honest in a way that no Valorian arena had witnessed for century. Esrith and Doyon circled each other on blood-stained sand, and both of them bore the marks of brutal combat. She had 3 broken fingers on her left hand and a deep gash across her ribs, and her golden skin was mottled with bruises. He was worse, much worse. His left arm hung useless at his side, and at least 4 of his ribs were cracked, and the blood loss alone should have killed him twice over. But humans had never learned to die when they were supposed to. Serith launched a spinning kick that would have shattered stone, and Dahyun twisted at the last instant and took the blow on his shoulder instead of his skull. The impact sent him tumbling across the sand, and he left a red trail behind him as he rolled. The crowd held its breath as he lay motionless. Then he moved one arm, pushed against the ground, and then the other, and slowly, impossibly stubbornly, he forced himself back to his feet. Serith stared at him with an expression that mixed frustration and confusion, and something that might have been awe. "Why will you not stay down?" she demanded. "Because I cannot," Dohyun replied, and he swayed on his feet but remained standing. Humans do not know how to quit, and we never learned how to accept that something was impossible. He coughed and blood flecked his lips. "We climbed out of caves and crossed oceans and reached for stars, and every step of the way someone told us it could not be done." His metal rod hung from fingers that barely had strength to grip it. "We did it anyway." Serith felt something crack inside her mind that had nothing to do with physical injury. She had spent 200 years believing that Valorian superiority was natural and inevitable and unquestionable. Now, a dying human was challenging everything she had ever known. "I am going to end this," she said, and her voice was quieter than before. "Not because the king commands it, and not because I hate you, but because I do not know what else to do." "I understand," Dohyun said, and there was no anger in his words. "You are doing what you were trained to do, and I am doing what I was born to do." He raised his rod one final time. "Let us see which one matters more." Serith attacked with everything she had left, and her fist rocketed toward his chest with enough force to stop a human heart. Dohyun did not try to dodge. Instead, he stepped into her attack and let her fist connect with his already broken ribs. The impact lifted him off his feet, and he knew that the blow had done serious damage, but he had chosen to take it because taking it meant getting close enough to deliver his own strike. His metal rod swung upward in a tight arc and caught her temple with a crack that echoed across the silent arena's. Serith's eyes went wide and then unfocused, and her body followed. A moment later, she collapsed onto the sand and did not move. The arena exploded into chaos. 300,000 voices cried out in shock and disbelief, and something that might have been joy. The Kovani section erupted with roars of triumph. The Thessan raised their elongated bodies high, and their hisses of approval filled the air. Even species that had remained silent throughout the fight now added their voices to the growing tumult. Dohyun stood over his fallen opponent, and he looked down at her with an expression that held no victory or satisfaction, only sadness. He knelt beside her, and the motion clearly caused him tremendous pain, and he touched her shoulder gently. "Can you hear me?" he asked. Serith's eyes fluttered open, and confusion clouded her features before memory returned. "I lost," she whispered. "Yes. No one has ever defeated me." "I know." She stared up at the human who had destroyed everything she believed about herself and the world. "Why did you not kill me?" she asked. "You had every right." Dohyun considered the question for a moment. "Because killing you was never the point," he said. "I did not come here to prove that humans are better than Valorians, and I did not come here to prove that you are weak." He offered her his hand. "I came here to prove that you could fall, and that anyone can fall no matter how powerful they seem." She stared at his hand, and the gesture confused her more than the defeat itself. Valorian victors did not help their opponents rise. They stood over them in triumph and demanded submission. "If I take your hand," she said, "everything changes. Everything is already changed." Do-hyun replied, "The only question is what we do with what comes next." She reached up and took his hand, and he helped her stand. Crowd fell silent again, but this silence was different. It was not shock or confusion. It was witnessing 300,000 beings watched a Valorian champion accept help from a human, and something shifted in the galaxy that would never shift. That King Zorath watched from his throne, and his ancient face was carved from stone. He understood what had happened. Even if he could not stop it, the human had not just won a fight, he had broken an idea, the idea that Valorians were invincible, the idea that resistance was futile, the idea that the weak should accept their weakness without question. That idea had held the Empire together for 4 centuries, and now it lay shattered on the arena sand. Like fragments of Sirith's armor, within weeks the first rebellion in a century broke out on Kovani Prime. Within months, 3 more worlds joined the resistance. Within a year, the Valorian Empire began to fracture along lines that had been invisible before, but now ran deep and wide. And throughout the galaxy, humans who had been dismissed as insignificant found themselves sought out by species who wanted to understand their secret. They were not the strongest or the fastest or the most advanced, but they had something that other species lacked. They had the absolute unshakable refusal to believe that anything was impossible. Kang Do-hyun survived his injuries, though. The recovery took months. He never sought fame or leadership or power. He returned to maintenance work because that was what he knew. But wherever he went, whispers followed. That is the human who broke the champion. That is the human who started the rebellion. That is the human who changed everything. He never corrected them, and never denied it, and never explained what he had really accomplished. The galaxy understood, even if they could not put it into words. King Zorath had wanted to make an example of humanity. He had succeeded, just not the example he intended. The chanting spread through the arena like fire through dry grass, and King Zorath rose from his throne with fury burning in his ancient eyes. This was supposed to be a demonstration of power, not a spark for rebellion. He signaled his royal guards, and 20 armored Valorians moved toward the arena floor with weapons drawn. "Stop this farce immediately," he commanded, and his amplified voice cut through the growing noise. "Seize the human and remove him from the arena." But before the guards could reach the sand, a new voice rang out. "I invoke the ancient protocols." Ambassador Silevex of the Thessan Confederation rose from her coiled position, and her serpentine body stretched to its full, impressive height. The laws of ritual combat were established by the first Valorian emperor, and they state clearly that no outside force may interfere once blood has been drawn on the arena floor. King Zorath turned his glare upon her, and most species would have withered beneath that gaze. "You dare to quote imperial law to me? The law exists to ensure fair combat," Silevex replied, and her voice did not waver. "If the Empire abandons its own traditions, then what legitimacy remains?" From the Corvani section, Elder Torvax stood with all 4 arms raised. "The Corvani second the invocation," he called out. "Let the combat conclude according to the ancient ways." Other voices joined, and other species rose, and within moments, representatives from a dozen subject worlds were standing in solidarity. With the Thessan Demandreth looked at the gathering resistance and calculated the political cost of ignoring it. Ritual combat laws were ancient and respected, and violating them openly would give ammunition to every faction that already questioned his rule. He could crush this defiance with military force, but that would take time and resources, and would only prove that the Empire needed violence to maintain order. With visible reluctance, he signaled his guards to stand down. "Very well," he said, and his voice dripped with barely contained rage. "Let the combat conclude, but Commander Valoran, you will end this now on the arena floor." Sareth had watched the political drama unfold with growing unease. The human had somehow transformed a simple execution into a galactic incident. Every moment this fight continued was another moment for dangerous ideas to spread through watching minds. She looked at Do-hyun, and he looked back at her, and something unspoken passed between them. "You planned this," she said, and it was not a question. "I hoped for it," he admitted, "but I could not be certain until I saw them stand." He gestured toward the crowd with his bloodied metal rod. "For 30 years, the Corvini have been silent, and for 2 centuries the Thessan have accepted their chains, and all of them believed that resistance was impossible because they had never seen anyone resist." His dark eyes met her golden ones. "Now they have seen it, and that changes everything." Sareth felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon her. She had spent her entire life serving the Empire and believing in its mission, and never once questioning whether that mission was right now. A bleeding human was forcing her to confront questions she had never asked. "Why?" she demanded. "Why sacrifice yourself for species that are not even your own? And why die for people you have never met?" "Because someone had to," Do-hyun said simply. "And because humans understand something that your empire forgot a long time ago." "What is that?" "That true strength is not about dominating others," he replied. "It is about standing up for them, even when it costs you everything." Sareth raised her blade, and the plasma edge hummed with lethal energy. "Philosophy will not save you now." "No," Do-hyun said, and he shifted into a fighting stance that looked almost peaceful. "But I have already done what I came to do, and everything after this is just details." She attacked with the full power of her augmented body, and her blade carved through the air like a falling comet. Do-hyun did not try to dodge this time. Instead, he moved toward her and used her own momentum against her and redirected her strike with his metal rod. The plasma edge missed his body by inches and continued its arc toward her chestplate, toward the crack that already weakened the armor. The king blade struck the damaged section with surgical precision, and plasma energy poured into the fracture and superheated the metal until it could no longer hold. It shaped Sareth, felt her armor tear itself apart as cascading failures rippled through every system chest plate, and shoulder guards and arm sections fell away in smoking fragments. Warning alerts screamed through her neural interface and then went silent as the processing unit melted into slag. Within seconds, she stood exposed on the arena sand with nothing but her bodysuit and her training to protect her. Crowd gasped, and the sound was like wind rushing through a canyon. 300,000 beings stared at the impossible sight of Commander Sareth Valoran stripped of her invincible armor. She looked down at herself and saw burns and bruises where the armor's failure had injured the flesh. Beneath, for 200 years, she had never faced combat. Without her protective shell, she had forgotten what vulnerability felt like. Do-hyun stood a few feet away, and his metal rod hung loosely at his side. He was in worse condition than she was, with blood covering most of his body and burns marking his skin and exhaustion pulling at every movement, but he was still standing. "Now we are equal," he said. "We are not equal," Sareth replied, and she dropped into a combat stance that required no weapons. "Valorians are naturally stronger and faster than humans, and even without my armor, I am more than enough to kill you." "I know," Do-hyun said, and something like respect entered his voice. "But you have never fought without your advantages, and you have never needed to learn how to struggle." He raised his rod again. "I have been struggling my entire life, and so has every human who has ever lived, and that is the difference between us." She attacked with her bare hands, and her natural speed and strength made each strike potentially lethal. But Do-hyun had fought this battle 1,000 times in his mind, and he had prepared for every scenario and calculated every response. Could not match her power, but he could anticipate her movements. He could not block her attacks, but he could redirect them. He could not defeat her through strength, but he had never intended to this. The crowd watched in breathless silence as human and Valorian clashed without the barriers of technology between them. Blood flew and bones cracked, and both fighters took damage. That would have ended lesser beings, but neither of them stopped, neither of them yielded, and somewhere in the stands, a Corvani child turned to her father and asked a question that would echo across the galaxy. "If a human can do this," she whispered, "then what else is possible?" Torvax looked at his daughter and felt something stir in his chest that had been dead for 30 years' hope. King Zorath gripped the armrests of his throne so tightly that the metal groaned beneath his fingers. This was not supposed to happen. The spectacle was meant to reinforce the natural order of the galaxy and remind every subjugated species that resistance was futile. Instead, he was watching his champion struggle against a creature that should have been broken within the first 30 seconds. He sent a private signal through his neural implant, and the message reached Sereth instantly. End this now and end it permanently. The rules of ritual combat no longer mattered. The political damage of allowing this human to continue breathing outweighed any concerns about tradition or honor. Sereth received the order and understood its implications. She would kill the human and deal with any diplomatic consequences later. The maintenance worker had already done too much damage, and every moment he remained standing was another moment for the watching species to question Valorian supremacy. She straightened her posture and pushed aside the confusion and doubt that had clouded her mind. The crack in her armor was concerning, but not crippling. Her system still functioned, and her plasma blade still hummed with deadly energy, and she was still faster and stronger than any human could ever be. "I underestimated you," she admitted, and her voice carried across the silent arena. "That will not happen again." Doyu nodded as if he had expected this moment. "I know," he said. "You are going to try to kill me now." "Yes, good," he replied, and the words seemed to confuse her. "That means you are finally taking me seriously." Sereth launched herself forward with speed that would have been invisible to most species. Her blade traced an arc of blue-white fire. As it descended toward his neck, Doyun threw himself sideways, and the plasma edge missed his throat by inches and left a burning line across his collarbone instead. He hit the ground and rolled and came up running as Sereth pursued with relentless precision. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the human fought for his life against the most dangerous warrior in the Empire. He could not match her speed, and he could not block her attacks, and every exchange left him more wounded than before. Burns and cuts accumulated across his body, and his gray uniform was now more red than gray from the blood that soaked the fabric. But he refused to fall. Every time Sereth thought she had finished him, he would twist or duck or stumble in exactly the right direction to avoid the killing blow. His metal rod lashed out whenever she overextended, and each strike targeted the same weaknesses he had identified before: the joint at her knee, the sensor cluster on her left shoulder, the cracked chest plate that grew more unstable with every impact. In the Corvani section of the crowd, an elder named Torvax watched with all four of his hands pressed against the railing. His people had been conquered 30 years ago when Valorian warships burned their homeworlds. Defense fleet from the sky. He had watched friends and family die, and he had bent his knee because there was no other choice. For 3 decades, he had believed that resistance was impossible. Now, he watched a human refuse to accept that truth. Beside him, his daughter Calyx leaned forward with her yellow eyes wide. "Father," she whispered, "how is he still moving?" Torvax did not have an answering the Thessan section. Ambassador Silvex coiled tighter around her seat as the fight continued. Her species had been subjugated for 2 centuries, and in all that time no Thessan had ever raised a hand against their masters. They had accepted their place in the order of things because the alternative was extinction, but this human had not accepted anything. Fought on with wounds that should have killed him, and endured pain that should have broken him, and showed no sign of surrender or despair. Selves had read reports about humans, and most of them described the species as unremarkable average strength and average intelligence and average everything, What the reports had failed to mention was their absolute refusal to stay down. The arena floor Doyen took a plasma burn across his back that made him stagger and nearly fall. Sereth pressed the advantage and drove him toward the wall with a flurry of strikes that left him no room to dodge. "Yield," she commanded, and her blade hovered inches from his heart. "Yield, and I will make your death quick." Doyun looked up at her with eyes that still held no fear. His face was pale from blood loss, and his hands trembled from exhaustion, and anyone could see that he was barely standing. But something burned in those dark human eyes that Sereth did not recognize. "I am not here to win," he said, and his voice was steady despite the pain. "I came here to show them what you are afraid of. I fear nothing." "Then why are you trying so hard to kill me?" Doyun asked, and gestured toward the silent crowd. This was supposed to be a spectacle about human weakness, and instead you are fighting like your life depends on ending mine. Sereth hesitated, and that hesitation lasted less than a heartbeat, but it was an Doyun understood something that she was only beginning to realize. The damage was already done. Every species watching had seen a human stand against a Valorian champion. They had seen him bleed and suffer and refuse to break. They had seen him crack armor that was supposed to be invincible. Whether he lived or died no longer mattered. The idea that Valorians could be defied had already taken root in 300,000 minds, and nothing could remove it. "Now, you want to know what humans have that other species lack?" Doyun said, and he straightened despite the agony it must have caused. "We have nothing, and that is why we fight so hard." He raised his metal rod. "Your empire took our homeworld's autonomy and gave us the lowest positions in your society and treated us like we were barely worth noticing, and you thought that it would break us." His voice grew stronger. "But humans have been breaking for 10,000 years, and every time we shatter, we put ourselves back together, and every time we fall, we learn how to climb, and you cannot defeat something that refuses to understand defeat." Sereth stared at him, and for the first time she saw not an enemy or a victim, but a mirror. He was showing her what strength really looked like, not power armor and plasma blades and centuries of conquests, but the simple stubborn refusal to accept that anything was impossible. She raised her blade for the killing stroke, and somewhere in the crowd a Kuravani voice began to chant a word that had not been spoken in public for 30 years. The word was resistance. Other voices joined. Then other species. The sound built like thunder rolling across the arena, and it crashed against the royal observation deck like a wave against Stone King Zoreth looked out at his subjects, and for the first time in 400 years, he felt something that might have been fear. The announcement echoed through every corner of the Valorian Empire like thunder rolling across 1,000 worlds. King Zoreth had declared a day of spectacle, and every species under his rule would witness it, whether they wanted to or not. The grand arena of Valoria Prime could hold 300,000 spectators, and today, every seat was filled with creatures from dozens of conquered worlds. The Kovani sat in their designated section with their forearms folded and their scaled faces showing nothing. The Thessan delegation occupied the upper tiers with their elongated bodies coiled around specially designed seating. Representatives from the Mordak Collective and the Yanari Federation filled the remaining spaces alongside 100 other species who had bent the knee to Valorian supremacy. All of them had been summoned to watch a demonstration. King Zoreth sat upon his elevated throne at the center of the royal observation deck, and his golden armor gleamed under the artificial suns that lit the arena. He was ancient by Valorian standards, with nearly 4 centuries of life behind him, and every one of those years had been spent building an empire that stretched across 3 galactic arms. His people were stronger than most species and faster than nearly all of them, and their technology had crushed every resistance that dared to rise against them. But strength alone did not maintain an empire. Fear was the true foundation, and fear required regular reinforcement. That was why He had arranged today's entertainment. Standing beside the throne was Commander Sereth Valoran, and she watched the preparations below with barely concealed irritation. She was the king's niece by blood and his champion by merit, and in 200 years of combat she had never tasted defeat. Her armor was ceremonial today, with intricate golden patterns traced across black metal plates, but it was still functional enough to stop plasma rounds and enhance her already formidable abilities. The blade at her hip had ended the lives of champions from 12 different worlds, and each kill was etched into the weapon's surface as a permanent record of her dominance today. She was supposed to add another mark, but this one felt like an insult. Human, she said, and her voice carried the weight of her displeasure. King Zoreth smiled without warmth. A human who forgot his place, he replied, and his deep voice rumbled through the observation deck. He refused to kneel before Commander Thyric on the maintenance vessel Ascendant Will, and when Thyric struck him for his insolence, the human struck back. Then execute him and be done with it. Execution teaches nothing, the king said, and he leaned forward on his throne. But humiliation teaches everything. In today, every species watching will remember what happens when the weak forget their weakness. Sereth wanted to argue, but she knew better. King had made his decision, and her role was to carry it out with the maximum amount of suffering and the minimum amount of dignity for the human involved. She would break him slowly and make him beg and weep and crawl before the gathered thousands. By the time she was finished, every human in the Empire would think twice before raising their eyes to a Valorianthe arena floor was circular and covered with compressed sand that would absorb blood without becoming slippery maintenance. Crews were finishing their preparations, and combat drones hovered at the edges to capture every angle. For broadcast across the Empire, the crowd grew louder as the massive gates at the arena's edge began to open for Valorian. Guards emerged first with their weapons drawn and energy shields active. Between them walked a human in chains. Kang Do-hyun was not what Sereth had expected. She had seen humans before as they scurried through the lower decks of warships and cleaned the waste systems of orbital stations and performed the countless menial tasks that kept the Empire functioning. Most of them were small and hunched and eager to avoid notice. This one walked upright with his shoulders back and his head level. He was average height for his species, which made him short compared to Valorians, and his body showed the lean muscle of someone who worked with their hands. His face was calm, and his dark eyes moved across the arena with an attention that seemed almost clinical. He was studying everything around him, and Sereth found that detail oddly unsettling. The guards brought him to the center of the arena and removed his chains. A fifth guard approached carrying a simple metal rod about 3 feet long and presented it to the human. That was his weapon. Sereth almost laughed at the absurdity of it. She would be facing him with plasma-edged steel and power armor and centuries of combat training, while he held a stick. The crowd certainly appreciated the humor, as waves of clicking and hissing and rumbling laughter rolled through the stadium, but Do-hyun simply took the rod and tested its weight and nodded once, as if it met his approval. The king rose from his throne, and the arena fell silent. Citizens of the Empire. His voice boomed through amplification systems that carried his words to every ear. Today you witness the consequence of defiance and the price of forgetting one's place in the natural order. He gestured toward Do-hyun. This human raised his hand against a Valorian officer, and such an act cannot go unanswered, but we are not without mercy, and he will be given the chance to defend himself against our champion. Scattered laughter rippled through the crowd. Commander Sereth Valoran has agreed to demonstrate the proper relationship between the strong and the weak, and when this human begs for mercy, she will grant it so that he may live the rest of his days as a reminder to others. Sereth descended from the observation deck through a private lift that deposited her at the arena's edge. The crowd roared as she stepped onto the sand, and the sound was thunderous enough to vibrate through her armor. He walked toward the center where Do-hyun waited, and each step was calculated to display her power and confidence. Up close, she could see more details about him. His hands were rough with calluses, and old scars in his knuckles showed evidence of past fights. His clothing was the simple gray uniform of a maintenance worker, with no armor and no protection, and his eyes followed her approach with an expression she could not quite identify. It was not fear, it was not anger, it was not even resignation. He watched her the way a technician might watch a machine, studying components and calculating functions. "Human," she said, and her voice carried across the arena. "The king has granted you a chance to preserve some small measure of dignity, and if you yield now and beg forgiveness, I will make your suffering brief." Do-hyun tilted his head slightly. "I spent 6 years repairing Valorian equipment," he said, and his voice was quiet but steady. "I know every system you use and every weakness it has." Sareth felt a flicker of something that might have been curiosity. "You think knowing how to fix a power conduit will help you survive this arena?" "No," he said, and something almost like a smile crossed his face. "But I learned other things too, and I learned that Valorians never guard against attacks from below, because no species has ever been low enough to strike from there." He raised his metal rod and settled into a stance that looked almost relaxed. "I am very low," he said, "and I have been watching for a very long time." Sareth drew her blade, and the plasma edge hummed to life with a sound like distant thunder. Crowd fell silent with anticipation. She had expected fear or bravado, or desperate courage. Instead, she saw patience, and for the first time in 200 years, she felt the smallest whisper of uncertainty. The signal horn sounded, and 300,000 voices roared their approval as the combat officially began. Sareth did not rush forward immediately. She was a veteran of countless battles, and she understood the value of reading an opponent before committing to an attack. But what was there to read about a human maintenance worker with a metal stick? She circled slowly, and her plasma blade cast flickering shadows across the sand. Do-hyun turned with her and kept his simple weapon raised in a guard position that looked almost competent. The crowd grew impatient quickly, as they had come for blood and spectacle, and this cautious circling was not what they wanted. Sareth heard scattered jeers from the Valorian sections, and she felt the weight of expectations pressing down upon her. Fine. She would give them what they wanted. She lunged forward with a sweeping horizontal strike designed to test his reactions, and the plasma edge screamed through the air fast enough to bisect an unarmored body before the victim could blink. Do-hyun was not there. He had moved the instant she committed to the attack and stepped sideways with a motion so efficient that it seemed almost lazy. Her blade passed through empty space. Sareth recovered and struck again with a downward cut that would split him from shoulder to hip. Again he moved, and again her weapon found nothing but air. She pressed the attack now with a combination that had overwhelmed warriors from a dozen worlds, and each strike flowed into the next with the precision of centuries of practice. The crowd gasped as Do-hyun wove between her attacks like water flowing around stones. Did not block because his metal rod could never withstand her plasma blade, and he did not retreat because that would give her control of the engagement. Instead, he moved into her attacks and found the gaps between her swings and occupied the spaces where her weapon could not reach. 1 minute passed, and then 2, and Sareth had not landed a single clean hit. The jeers from the crowd had stopped. Now there was only confused murmuring as thousands of spectators tried to understand what they were witnessing. This was not possible. Humans were slow and weak and fragile, and no human should be able to read Valorian combat forms well enough to avoid them. But Do-hyun moved with absolute certainty, as if he knew where her blade would be before she swung it. "Stand still." Sareth growled, and her frustration was beginning to show. "Face your death with some courage. I am not here to die." Do-hyun replied, and he was not even breathing hard. "I am here to show them something." He gestured toward the crowd with his metal rod. All of them have seen Valorians fight, and all of them believe you are invincible. And today, I'm going to prove that you are not. Sareth felt heat rise in her chest as anger began to replace her professional detachment. This human was not just defying her. He was using her as a demonstration. She attacked with genuine intent now and abandoned the theatrical restraint that the king had requested. Her blade carved the air with killing force, and the plasma edge left trails of superheated atmosphere in its wake. The sand beneath her feet melted into glass with each step as energy radiated from her weapon. Dohyun dodged and wove and ducked, but he could not avoid everything forever. A glancing strike caught his shoulder and left a smoking burn across his gray uniform. Another swing opened a cut across his thigh that immediately began bleeding. The crowd cheered at the sight of human blood, but Dohyun did not fall, and he did not yield, and he did not show any sign of pain. Beyond a slight tightening around his eyes, he kept moving and kept watching and kept waiting for something that only he could. Caesareth cornered him against the arena wall with nowhere left to run. Enough games, she said, and raised her blade for a strike that would take his arm clean off. The king wanted you humiliated, but I think a permanent reminder will serve the same purpose. She swung with all her augmented strength, and the plasma edge descended like a falling star. Dong did not dodge. He stepped forward directly into her attack and inside her reach and drove his metal rod upward with both hands. The rod found the tiny gap at her armpit joint where the ceremonial armor plates met without overlapping. It was a weakness in the design that existed because no enemy had ever gotten close enough to exploit it. No enemy had ever thought to look for such a small flaw in such formidable protection. The impact was not powerful by Valorian standards, but it did not need to be. The rod jammed into the gap and twisted, and the torque transferred through the joint mechanism in ways the armor was never designed to handle. Something cracked. Zareth felt the vibration run through her entire suit as warning lights flickered across her internal display. The ceremonial chestplate, which was meant to be an unbreakable symbol of Valorian supremacy, developed a fracture that spread like a spiderweb across its surface. She staggered backward and a swing went wild and missed Dohyun by several feet. The arena fell absolutely silent. 300,000 spectators stared at the crack in her armor with expressions of disbelief. The Corvani delegation leaned forward as one dozen ambassadors uncoiled from their seats. With sudden attention, King Zoreth rose from his throne with his golden face twisted into an expression of fury. Impossible, Sareth whispered, and she looked down at the damage as if she could not believe her own eyes. You cannot have done this. Dohyun stood a few feet away and blood dripped from his wounds, and his simple uniform was burned and torn. But he was smiling now with a genuine expression that held no mockery or cruelty. 6 years, he said. I spent 6 years watching Valorians train and fight and spar, and you never noticed because I was just a human fixing broken equipment in the corner of the room. He raised his metal rod and pointed it at her cracked armor. I learned your forms and your techniques and your weaknesses, and none of you ever thought to hide them from someone so low. The crowd began to murmur, and the sound built like a wave gathering strength before it crashes against the shore. They had come to watch a human humiliated. Instead, they had witnessed something that should not exist. They had seen Valorian armor break. Sareth touched the crack in her chestplate and felt the sharp edges of fractured metal beneath her fingers. In 200 years of combat, no opponent had ever breached her defenses. Now, a human with a metal stick had done what champions and warriors and heroes from across the galaxy had failed to accomplish. She looked at Dohyun with new eyes, and for the first time she truly saw him not as a weak primitive to be crushed beneath her heel, but as something far more dangerous, something patient, something that had been watching and learning and waiting, and now it had stopped waiting.